Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. We're going to give it about 1 more minute to allow more people to join, and then we'll get started. Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Shiloh Holley. I'm the Executive Director at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for our virtual parlor chat. And tonight marks 1 year of us doing this virtual programming series. And tonight we will be talking about A Feminine Space, Eliza Jumel at Home, 1810 to 1865 with Erin Eisenbarth. Just a few housekeeping measures. This is a Zoom webinar and it is being recorded. Your video and audio are automatically turned off when you enter the Zoom room. And if you want to connect with us during the program this evening, feel free to use either the chat, raise your hand, or Q&A function. We do have a moderator that'll be moderating, taking a look at all three, and you can interact with us that way. Programs like these are made possible through the kindness and generosity of patrons like you, and we invite you to make a donation to the mansion today to help us sustain our free and low-cost programming. Feel free to text MJM to 44312 or click the link in the chat, which is morrisjumel.org/donate. And tonight, if you donate $20 or more or become a member, we will be entering your name into a raffle for this very beautiful art tile piece done by local artist Diane DeMoro from her series Art in the Eye of the Beholder. And these are custom Eliza Jumel pieces that were done a few years ago. And we're so excited to share this with you tonight. Again, text MJM to 44321 or check out the links in the chat. A few upcoming events. On Sunday, we're starting a new outdoor music concert series starting on May 23rd for the next five Sundays at 4:30 p.m. It's a partnership with Gather New York, which will feature classical musicians from throughout New York City. We have a webinar upcoming, The History of Ice Cream, with my colleague Meg Lynch, including a DIY ice cream making demo. And for those of you who don't know, ice cream was George Washington's favorite dessert, and he likely served it at the cabinet dinner that was held on our lawn in 1790. And our next virtual parlor chat in June will be about heritage roses and community gardens. So feel free to register for that. All information about these programs is available at morrisjumel.org. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Erin Eisenbarth. She's a historian whose work focuses on 18th and 19th century American decorative arts and material culture, gender, and the history of collecting. She holds advanced degrees from Bard Graduate Center and University of Delaware's Winter Third program in American material culture. She's worked as an assistant curator in the American Decorative Arts Department at Yale University Art Gallery and has contributed to numerous exhibitions and publications on American fine and decorative arts. She has curated exhibitions and published research on Connecticut silver, American folk art, and jewelry. She currently teaches American history at Mercy College and is working on a project about collectors of George Washington memorabilia. So before we hear from Erin, I wanted to share a little bit about the biography of Eliza Jumel and how we have drawn from primary sources and our own decorative arts collection to inform our understanding of Eliza, a woman who bolstered her position within New York society through constantly reinventing her persona. Betsy Bowen, later known as Eliza Jumel, was born into poverty in Providence, Rhode Island, just a few weeks before the start of the American Revolution. And she died one of the wealthiest women in America just a few months after the American Civil War ended. The details of her early life aren't entirely clear, but sources indicate that Eliza was a survivor, she was self-educated, and a unique woman for her time. After her mother and stepfather passed away, she moved to New York and began referring to herself as Eliza Brown. She worked as an actress at New York's Park Theater and met wealthy wine merchant Stephen Jamelle, and they would later marry in 1804. Eliza had a savvy mind for business and increased their wealth through various real estate investments, which saved them from ruin when Stephen's businesses faltered. After Stephen's death, she married former Vice President Aaron Burr. And the images that you see on the screen here are a selection of portraits from Eliza throughout her life. The first one beginning in 1796 and the last one in the 1860s, shortly before she passes away. Some of these have some dubious attribution, such as the first one, in which early Jamelle biographies indicated that this was actually a portrait of Eliza Jumel, but the National Portrait Gallery, which owns the piece, indicates that it's actress Marie Delacroix, which could likely have been Eliza since she had a history working as an actress. Eliza and Stephen purchased the Morris-Jumel mansion in 1810, which at that time was known as Mount Morris. And the building had been vacant for some time, and they originally used it as their summer home once they moved in. They set about renovating the house, including some interior finishings and furnishings and modifications to the portico, which expanded the porch, balcony, and redid the entry door and windows by adding side lights and fan lights. The Jumels traveled to Paris in 1815, where it was rumored they ran in the same circles as Napoleon. Their renovation of the house was done using French wallpapers and a mix of imported and American furniture. During her time in France, Eliza began collecting European art and accrued a collection of over 250 paintings. She is believed to be the first major American collector of European art and believed to have used the main hall of the mansion as a gallery space. The myths surrounding Eliza's origins, social connections, and lifestyle persist to this day, compounded by her own telling of her biography, and even her obituary, which was published in the New York Times, was riddled with errors. Her family, including her adopted relatives, contributed to the myth-making. After Eliza's estate was settled, her adopted grandniece sold many of the family belongings at a 1913 silo sale auction. Items from this auction have been meticulously documented thanks to this catalog and the work of the museum's first curator, William Shelton. And to this day, pieces from this sale come across our radar. And just last year, thanks to the generosity of a donor, we are fortunate enough to acquire 2 armchairs matching 2 previously held in our collection. And ones that were documented to have been acquired by Eliza and Stephen when they were in France and used here at the mansion. These chairs will be conserved and reupholstered to match their suite mates, which you can see here. And these furnishings have recently been reinstalled at the museum, and I will speak a little bit about that a little bit later in the program. So the museum is currently undertaking a reinterpretation plan of its 9 period rooms centered on primary source materials from the Jumels' occupation of the home from 1810 to 1865. This 1882 illustration held in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York depicts the front hall of the mansion, and along with other documentations, such as an 1825 letter where Eliza is requesting marble wallpaper, gray marble wallpaper for the front hall. These all have informed our selections of the interior finishings. Additionally, other clues found and other visual representations of Eliza assist in informing our understanding of her in the mansion she called home for 55 years. Take a look at this miniature from 1832, which was likely a mourning portrait after the death of Stephen Jamelle, her first husband, currently held in the collection of the New York Historical Society. If you take a look at her left elbow, it's resting on a pier table, which is very similar to the pier table that we have in our collection today. And the portrait of Eliza, which currently hangs in Octagon Room, has also informed our selections. If you take a look at the background, you can see stylized clouds. And this also was noted in the letter that Eliza wrote to Stephen, that she was requesting cloud wallpaper for the back room. Additionally, you can take a look at the red upholstery which is in the mansion today, which is very reminiscent of the red upholstered bolster that you see Eliza's right elbow in this image resting upon. However, no matter the documentation and conclusions that we draw from these sources, the myths of Eliza persist and often blend fact and fiction. And here's an image of the Octagon Room as we see it today. And I'd like to leave you with one final image of the museum from 1975, which showcases Madame Jamelle's bed, rumored to once have been owned by Napoleon and thought to be where she passed away in 1865. This bed style and other furnishings and decorative art objects will be discussed more formally by our guest this evening, Erin Eisenbarth, who will speak about 19th century feminine domestic spaces and how some pieces with Jamelle provenance contribute to these narratives. Following Erin, I will give a formal update on the reinterpretation of the museum's period rooms, including the exciting news of the opening of 2 spaces. We're going to do the screen shuffle, and I'm going to pass it on to Erin. So without further ado, you can take it away.
Sorry, that didn't quite work how I expected. Let me try that again. Okay, there we go. So thanks for that introduction, Shiloh, and for that brief look at Eliza Jumel's fascinating life. As I think Shiloh's story about Eliza, it makes clear she had an extraordinary life and really lived through some pretty extraordinary times as well. But her life didn't just encompass the political changes from the American Revolution to the American Civil War. She also lived through a lot of social and cultural changes as well. And those are kind of what I'm here to talk about tonight. I want to talk about the changing role of women and the divisions between the world of men and the world of women that were increasingly drawn in the first half of the 19th century, between the public world of men and the marketplace and the private world of women and the home. I'm going to tell you what these ideals were and then show you how they manifest in the design of domestic furniture and architecture of the period, with sort of a special emphasis on how we can see some of this in the rooms and furnishings of the Morris-Jumel mansion. So to begin with, I'm going to take you on a quick women's history lesson. Many women in America hoped that the American Revolution might bring about a revolution for women as well, changing their legal and political status to give them full citizenship rights. You can see, for example, part of Abigail Adams's famous letter to her husband, where she asks him to remember the ladies while he's busy writing the Declaration of Independence. But though Abigail and others advocated for women's citizenship, it soon became pretty clear that even in this new nation, a woman's place was going to be the home. The federal era, the sort of era after the revolution when the young United States is getting set up, ushered in an unprecedented era of women's education, with countless new female schools and academies opening up all along the Eastern Seaboard to educate the daughters of the well-to-do. These schools had pretty amazing curriculums, languages, arithmetic, geometry, history, literature. But all of this education was focused it wasn't done for women themselves. It was done with the idea that women were going to need to be trained to be proper wives and mothers who could raise up and support the new male citizens that this nation was going to need. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who's a famous sort of philosopher and reformer of the period, delivered long lectures like his 1787 Thoughts Upon Women's Education, where he listed out all the things that he thought a woman ought to know and why he thought they were useful skills. And the justifications for these skills were always that they could instruct their sons in the principles of liberty and government. That they could be stewards of their husband's property and good companions for sensible men. So all of this education is happening so that women can be good wives and mothers. This is about 1810 embroidered and painted piece by Sarah Skinner Ward, who probably made it at Miss Sarah Maltby's school in Philadelphia. And this kind of shows you sort of both the fad for classical art and design at the period, but also kind of what women's education was about. Here we see Calliope, the muse of heroic poetry, and Clio, the muse of history, honoring George Washington, that's his face in the easel there, while a little girl sort of sits at their feet and learns things. And these schools often taught embroidery, drawing, music, along with more sort of prosaic skills. And these pieces are often kind of seen as one of the culminations of a young woman's education at these schools, proof that she'd received an education and had been sufficiently refined to be a good wife and mother for the life that lays ahead of her. A lot of well-to-do women learned these skills as children and teens, but Eliza Jumel's education and refinement would take place later on in her life. As a child, she might have learned plain sewing and housekeeping skills, but learning to sew, fine embroidery, or learning to act, move, and speak with the refinement expected of an upper-class woman was a skill she taught herself as an adult, aided by her own natural survival skills, her talent as an actress, and the efforts and funds of her husband, Stephen, who paid for things like her French lessons. Though Eliza had to learn how to be a lady on her own, she was very conscious about what a woman's education should entail and made sure that her wards, her niece and later her grandniece, got the proper education that she herself had been denied, and made sure that they had the painting and music kinds of lessons that she had lacked. As the 19th century progresses, this idea of women as sort of literally the mothers of the Republic solidifies into what historians have called the doctrine of separate spheres, the cult of true womanhood, or the cult of domesticity. And all of these terms basically talk about the idea that the world is divided into two spheres. There's a public sphere of the marketplace, business and industry, and a private sphere of the home. And I don't think anyone here will be shocked to learn that the public sphere is for men in this reading, and the private sphere and the home is the realm of women. The domestic sphere was centered around ideas of purity, piety, and submissiveness. Women were supposed to maintain a clean and calm home, somewhere where their husbands could relax and refresh after a day spent in the trenches of business, and a place where children could literally sit at their mother's knee and learn not just their ABCs, but the values and skills that they would need for their adult lives as upstanding citizens of the nation. These two illustrations from Godey's Ladies Book and from the firm of Currier and Ives kind of illustrate these ideals of what the woman's sphere should be like. And it's no coincidence that they're both set in parlors, which I'll talk about a little later. before I move on to some specific examples, I just want to add sort of one caveat, which is that these separate spheres were not for every woman. The idea that women could and should confine themselves to the private world of the home was limited to upper and upper middle class white women. Poor women, particularly women of color and immigrants, were still expected to work, often outside the home in positions that were generally low status, low pay, and occasionally quite dangerous. It was their labor that made it possible for more elite, wealthy white women to stay inside their separate spheres. Many women chafed at these restrictions, and I imagine that to some degree Eliza Jumel did as well. Certainly the idea that she would be dependent on her husband for financial support and security seems to have been something that was unacceptable to her. Her interest in business, which made her scandalous, may have been largely motivated by this idea of sort of achieving financial security for herself and not having to depend solely on men. So she was always kind of willing to step out of her separate sphere when she needed to. So how do these ideas about a woman's proper place manifest in the furnishings of the home? And how do we see them at work in Eliza's life? I want to show you by presenting some examples of the way gender works in the home in 3 rooms of an elite 19th century home: the dining room, parlor, and bedroom. Beginning in the late 18th century and continuing on throughout the 19th, the rooms and furnishings of the American home begin to undergo a process of specialization. Prior to this, there were a lot of multi-purpose rooms where you moved the furniture around to do specific activities. But now you have rooms for particular purposes: dining rooms instead of just setting up a table in your main room, private bedrooms instead of putting beds in parlors. And as rooms become specialized, so does furniture. Americans aspired to gracious and refined living based largely on European aristocratic precedents. And the ideas of having enough money to have enough room for specialized rooms and furniture is certainly part of this, as are ideas that these rooms and furnitures are gendered. Dining rooms are a really interesting case here, and this is the dining room at the mansion. They start to become popular in the United States in the second half of the 18th century is really when you start to see them show up. And the dining room is part of the original 1765 house. So the Morrises who built it were already kind of thinking about, they wanted this kind of elite space. You might expect that because dining rooms are associated with food and cooking are sort of the women's sphere, that dining rooms would be coded female, but actually they're often viewed as a male space for much of the 19th century. I'm gonna go back for just a moment. This painting, The Dining Room, the Dinner Party by Henry Sargent, sort of shows you the dining room as this kind of male socialization space. They were a place for men to socialize in the home where they could gather without women. This is actually the picture of a private supper club in Boston where men kind of gathered at each other's homes. So only men were allowed at parties like this. But even when you did have both men and women at your dinner party, the men retained possession of the dining room when the meal was over and stayed there to smoke and drink and socialize while women withdrew to parlors. Here we see all of the fashionable elements of a parlor: a dining table and chairs, a sideboard displaying knife boxes and ceramics, and a sideboard alcove, which is a feature that maybe the Morris-Jumel mansion is one of the earliest in the United States to have. It's a special kind of little nook where you could put your sideboard and serving implements and keep them out of the flow of traffic in your dining room. Sideboards are a really crucial part of dining room furniture because they're an area for display, not just of food, but also of the silver, glass, porcelain, and other fine goods needed to serve it. The abundance of food and drink and the fineness of your silver and ceramics was part of the way a family could show that they were wealthy, and that the man was a successful provider for his family. This idea that sideboards are a display space for manliness and mastery over nature becomes even more exaggerated in the later 19th century. And even though it's a little later, I couldn't resist showing you this on the right, which is an 1850s sideboard, which really takes this idea of abundance and mastery over nature and hunting and gathering and makes it very literal. It features the American eagle, it features dead stags, dead birds, and even Native Americans, all of which sort of symbolize the bounty of America that the male owner of this piece has dominated and is in control of. So dining rooms are a sort of space for men to show off their skills at providing for their family. The parlor, however, is a female space. It's where gender roles are literally put on display. Parlors are not a new form, but they get more specialized and refined. Beds used to be a common feature of parlors in the 18th century. They move upstairs to bedrooms. Messy domestic work moves to the kitchen or out of the home entirely, and parlors become a space for socializing with friends and for the moral instruction of the family. This is another Henry Sargent painting. This time he's showing us a tea party with all the elements of a well-to-do parlor or drawing room. A center table, lots of chairs for friends, family, and visitors, carpet that stretches across the room, elaborate draperies and mirrors, and objects that show off the family's wealth and taste. You can see many of these as well in the octagon room and in the French parlor here at the mansion. Here in those two rooms too, we have the addition of French wallpaper, which was another really high status item that you might put in your parlor. Parlor furniture usually came in matching sets or suites. This is a set from the Met in a period room, and here are some of the individual pieces. This particular set is by New York cabinet maker Duncan Fife, and was for merchant Thomas Purcell, a contemporary of Stephen Jumel's. It originally consisted of a sofa, 2 armchairs, 10 side chairs, and 2 footstools. And this is not at all an uncommon amount of furniture to be part of one of these suites. Armchairs are for the men and for honored and important male visitors, whereas women sat on side chairs and sofas. As the 19th century progressed, these gender roles of chairs get even more and more extreme. Here is an 1850s example on the left and an 1870s example on the right. The male gentlemen's armchairs are bigger, fancier, and of course have armrests, while the women's chairs are slightly smaller, plainer, and do not. And if you're thinking that these armchairs look a little like thrones, you're not wrong. That's sort of exactly the impression that they were meant to give. The women's chairs don't have arms for 2 reasons. One is sort of to differentiate them in terms of power from men's chairs, but the other reason is because women's skirts are getting bigger. And at a certain point, a woman in a full hoop skirt, for example, couldn't even fit into an armchair. As I mentioned, parlors are a site for socializing and for fostering family togetherness. They're where women teach their children and where you put on performances of respectability for your friends and neighbors. This is where coffee and tea are served, both rituals that involved incredible amounts of material culture, but also really elaborate rules and rituals for how to be a proper guest and a proper visitor. And people were very anxious about this. Were they pouring their tea right and drinking their tea right? All because they kind of wanted to show off their respectability and refinement. Some other things you might find in the parlor and that you can find in the parlor at the mansion include musical instruments. Musical instruments are another piece of furniture that is coded feminine. Men certainly did play, but the piano was really sort of assumed to be a woman's instrument. Musical training, as I mentioned before, was a central part of a refined young woman's education. And it's also an important way you could provide entertainment for your family. Without radios or records, this is how you had something to listen to and a way to pass your time. But not everybody is good at music. If you've watched, or read Pride and Prejudice, you know that not all the Bennet sisters were very good piano players. And the same seems to have been true of both Eliza Jumel and her niece Mary, because in 1819, Stephen wrote to her discouraging her from purchasing a new piano and noting that, quote, "Neither you nor Mary is famous for your playing." But even if you were more enthusiastic than talented, piano playing was an important way a woman could show off the sort of skills, the sort of skills of refinement. You also find desks, both in public spaces like parlors and in private bedrooms. And desks are gendered too. They're essential places where you could write letters, but also store documents, account books, and other such papers. And many of them have, in this period, have locks and secret compartments that allow you to do just that. This is a roll-top desk by Duncan Fife on the left, and a secrétaire à bâton, or fall front desk on the right, where it is closed and open. Desks like this were used by both men and women, but there were a special genre of desks called women's desks or ladies' desks. And if you look at them, you can definitely see the kind of difference in labor that people were expected to do at them. These are women's desks. They're lighter, smaller, more decorated, and they have much less storage space. They rarely have the kind of big bookcases that you see on desks. These women's desks speak to the way that women were increasingly not expected to be doing sort of serious business work, which means it probably shouldn't surprise us that Eliza Jumel seems to have gone for the big desks, the serious desks. Both in the parlor and in the bedroom, she had the larger fall front desks. Not surprising, given that we know how important real estate, business, and finance were to her. One piece of furniture that was only for women is the work table. These provided a work surface and a storage space for your sewing. Women of all statuses knew how to do plain sewing, but as I mentioned before, fancy embroidery was only for elite women. And of course, if you're going to be making a fancy piece of embroidery, you need a fancy work table to store it in. And these could be quite elaborate. This is a version that incorporated a writing desk as well, so that a woman could do her correspondence and her sewing. Both desks and bookcases can be found in bedrooms. And here we have Eliza's French bed again. Bedrooms are increasingly part of the private female sphere of the home by this period. It's only for close family members and friends. You only invite very close people into your bedroom, people who you trust to see you in an informal state. It's where you sleep, it's where you get ready for the day. So it's a very private kind of space. And a lot of the furniture in it is really about ideas of getting dressed and proper and presentable for your day ahead. Eliza's Oh, this is a photo of some of the new installation of Eliza's bedroom. You can't really see the bed so well in this, which is why I had the other picture, but you can see that she's got a desk, work table, and dressing mirror in there. Eliza's bed is a new style in this period, the French bed or sleigh bed. Given that we know she was a bit of a Francophile, it's not surprising that this is what she went for. On the left, you can see Madame Recamier's bed at the Louvre, which is sort of a great example of this, this style with fancy wood, fancy gilded decorations, and elaborate drapery. And you can see that this older installation picture of Eliza's bedroom is really mimicking a lot of these elements, right down to the swan decorations. I'm going to put this black and white picture up again so that you can hopefully get a good look at the swan at the top, which is a sort of classic symbol for feminine grace and beauty and purity. And these beds are also they're very theatrical to me, and I can't help but think that that's probably another reason why they appealed to Eliza Jumel, who was certainly a woman with the flair for the dramatic. And with the drapery behind them, these beds often seem to me like little stage sets. So I think that that's also part of the appeal. Once a woman got out of bed, she had to get ready to face the day ahead of her, and would have used dressing tables, what we would maybe call a vanity today, part of the crucial process of getting ready. This example on the left incorporates a wash basin, chamber pot, and storage for all of your beauty needs. While the version on the left takes that combination writing desk and work table one step further by adding a mirror to it so that it can also serve to help you get ready. And this is in a way very similar to what Eliza had in her room. This work table with a mirror indicates to me that it's a bedroom piece that she could have used to store sewing or to help herself get ready. I also just wanted to show you a better picture of her dressing glass, her large mirror. These are again a newish piece of furniture in this period because having a mirror of this size is definitely a luxury. Eliza was a woman who was very conscious of appearances, and so you want a mirror so that you can be dressed properly and correctly. Eliza Jumel followed a lot of the rules about what a woman ought to do and say and act and how she ought to furnish her home. But she was also a woman who was not afraid to break the rules. And I'm going to end by talking quickly about one last space that I think matters to our understanding of Eliza, the gallery. As Shiloh mentioned, Eliza was one of the earliest collectors, not just female collectors, but collectors of paintings in the United States. And collecting, especially art collecting, was something that men did. It was a male field because it requires money, it requires specialized knowledge of the art world, it requires going out, meeting artists and going to galleries, and it requires an aggressive business sense. And these are all things that were more acceptable for men to do than for women to do. Again, to go back to the dining room, you can think of collecting as another form of hunting and gathering. So it's another thing that men should do. Eliza's collection is one way in which she very clearly stepped out of the feminine realm and into the male realm, and received some criticism for it. Even though she lent more than half of the paintings to the 1817 American Academy of Fine Arts show, which is one of the earliest art shows in the country, she couldn't be a member. They were happy to take her paintings, but not happy to have her membership. Women were not allowed. Even though she sold her paintings in the 1820s, the idea, the appeal of art, the appeal of the gallery space stayed with her as this late 19th century watercolor shows, and she kept sort of an art gallery in her home for most of her life. So to conclude, 19th century America was a society obsessed with rules for correct and proper behavior. Eliza Jumel is extraordinary in part because she's self-made. She taught herself these rules. The circumstances of her birth would have excluded her from polite society, but she found a way in by learning the rules of female behavior and marrying well. But in her determination to do this, to secure a comfortable and interesting and well-lived life, she often ventured into areas generally reserved for men, like business and art collecting. She knew that in the pursuit of refinement and comfort, sometimes the rules about a woman's proper place need to be broken. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, so much for that overview and for providing us with the visual vocabulary to apply to period rooms and gendered spaces. It was a pleasure to hear. Before we move to Q&A, I do see that there are a few in the chat, so keep them coming. I just wanted to spend a few moments and do a little bit of a formal update about our period rooms that will be opening shortly. You did get to see some sneak peeks in both of our presentations. Let's see, yes. So, as mentioned, the Morris-Jumel Mansion is currently going through a five-phase reinterpretation plan. Phase 3 is concluding right now, and those rooms are the formal French parlor, which you see here, and Eliza's bedroom up on the second store. This project was graciously funded by the Versailles Foundation with support by the Knickerbocker chapter of the National Society of the Daughters of American Revolution, and a private individual who donated 2 collection items to supplement our collection. These 2 rooms are the rooms with the most items that have Jamelle trace provenance, mostly things that were sold at the Shiloh sale and listed in that auction catalog. Here are a few more details of the formal French parlor, so you can see the interior finishings and decorative arts a little bit more up close. A note about the carpet and also the wallpaper is that we try to get as close to the original production and manufacturing as possible. So these carpets are woven on some early mid-19th century looms. The material is wool and they're hand sewn and hand pieced together, much like that they would have been done in the 1820s when they were installed. Likewise with the wallpaper, this wallpaper was constructed and designed by David Skinner Wallpapers of Ireland. And as in many of the spaces of the mansion, it's hand blocked or hand printed. Again, going back to using very delicate documented materials and having it as close as possible to the original. Here is another view of Eliza's bedroom. Again, this is a room with documented pieces with Jamelle provenance, including the suite that you see here, the bed, the secretary Aventant, and the cheval mirror, all which Erin talked about. And then we have the details a little bit up close here of the carpeting and the wallpaper and one of the end caps of the bed with this formal gilded design, very classical here. I wanted to mention one note about the wallpaper here. We actually found a fragment in the museum archives, which we did a historical analysis on, and it actually dates to the 1820s. And it was labeled as being removed sometime over the museum's history from Eliza's bedchamber. So we commissioned David Skinner Wallpaper. I believe my colleague Megan may put a link to his website in the chat to reproduce a design using this fragment of what would have been at the mansion. So, you know, here again, we are using as many primary source materials as we can to aid us in our interpretation of the period rooms. And again, these period rooms are on view now. We are just wrapping up some of the final touches, such as installing some draperies and the bed hangings. So that's why there's no images of Eliza Jumel's bed right now, because we're awaiting on the installation of the bed hangings to bring it back to its former glory. I want to again thank Erin so much for being with us tonight. This has been a lovely conversation and more to continue through the questions, and one way to honor Historic Preservation Month and the work that we're doing at the mansion. Here is some of our social media if you guys want to stay connected. And again, I urge anyone to make a donation to help support our efforts to keep programming free and low cost. You can text MJM to 44312 or click the link in the chat. I believe we had some really great questions so far, and I just wanted to start off. And when we were originally talking, when we were talking last week, Erin, you mentioned, you were talking about the armchairs being for the men and the side chairs being for the women. And I just had this aha moment because the suite in the Octagon room, which maybe we can somehow put a photo up, but that space did not, at least to our knowledge, did not include any armchairs. So the suite of furniture that was commissioned by the Jumels, by Duncan Fife, which here it is here, included only 12 side chairs. So, just thinking about how Eliza Jumel would have used the space. Oh, well, I thought it was going to land on the proper slide. It's really fascinating to me that this suite of furniture didn't include any armchairs, meaning that, this quite possibly would have been a more feminine space.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting possibility, and I would love to delve into more of what we know about the records from the furnishings. Armchairs definitely are for men, and later on in the 19th century, we get the chairs with sort of the cutaways for women's skirts, but everyone can sit on a side chair. And so there are always more side chairs than armchairs just because you're going to have more guests, and they're sort of for everyone. So it is surprising to me that she didn't have a few, but she, as we've discovered, she's a woman who likes to kind of buck expectations. So maybe she didn't feel, without a husband in residence most of the time, maybe she didn't feel they were as necessary.
Yeah. We also had a question from Lisa regarding some of the furnishings. So the pieces that you showed that were multi-purpose, the vanity combination writing desk, those were built historically as multi-purpose, correct? Not retroactively fit to be multi-purpose.
Yes, I believe that most of them, I won't rule out the possibility that some got retrofitted, but most of the ones that I'm aware of were constructed this way, sort of with this multi-purpose function.
Great. A question just came in from Jennifer. Who would select the furniture for a 19th century home, men or women?
That's actually a really complicated question, and it totally depends on the personalities involved. Some people are just more interested in and care more about their house furnishings than others. But we do know from the correspondence that Eliza was often asking Stephen to buy certain things and send certain things back. So he's buying them, but sort of at her direction. And that seems to be fairly common because men are the ones out doing business. They're the ones who would maybe go to a cabinet maker and strike up that relationship. But they're often acting on women's ideas about what they want, what color, what kind, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I have a question about symbolism, and I'm hoping maybe one of our docents, Marguerite, can weigh in the chat if she's still with us. But we had a note from, I believe it was, Helene, saying that the swans also were symbolic of love. But if I'm not mistaken, the swan was also a Napoleonic symbol. Not only do we have the swan chairs in our suite of armchairs, but they're the swan tresser on the bed hangings, and then the Napoleonic set of wings in the entry hall, which we also looked at earlier. Marguerite would be happy to have you weigh in a little bit. But Erin, can you talk a little bit more about the use of animals and symbolism with swans or other elements during this period?
Sure. Well, This period is one that's very heavily invested in the designs and symbols of antiquity. And so, you often see symbolic use of animals. We've talked about swans, you see lions, you see bees, which again have a Napoleonic connotation. But there's eagles, both for Napoleon and for the United States. There's all kinds of birds and animals that show up on the decorative arts of this period. And people are looking to sort of the classical symbolism of them as a way of indicating their familiarity with classical art.
And great. I'm hoping that our docent Marguerite can pipe in. She mentioned something in the chat. She's my resident French expert who I turn to with questions. Marguerite, would you like to add anything?
Of course, I'll be glad to. So yes, swans are associated with love. They thought that swans mate for life, which now has been proven wrong. Everybody's disappointed. And so they often were used as a symbol of love, and the swans were often floating above the crib in the 19th century. Even my grandfather has a swan floating over his crib. And it was, from that love came the baby. Bees do it and swans do it too. The symbols for Napoleon outside of the bees, of course, were more eagle. And even the wings for me are more eagle wings and more regal and powerful than the swans.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Marguerite. And also very interesting. We touched a little bit about Eliza's biography, and she didn't have any biological children, but did adopt. So, that I wonder how purposeful it was for her naturally gravitating, or our interpretation of her naturally gravitating to that swan symbolism.
Well, it might also be because everybody had it. So you were supposed to have children. It's kind of a catch-22. The furniture implies love and children.
Interesting. Also regarding Eliza, I believe that someone had a question earlier if we were talking a little bit about the biography of Eliza in the first section because they missed the program. I briefly touched on that in my introduction. Again, this program will be recorded, and it'll be on YouTube directly after this, after the program this evening. Someone had a question regarding Eliza's birth records. I believe there are some spotty primary source documents that we've had tracing her to Providence. Again, she went through, I don't know, 2 or 3 formal and informal name changes. Maybe my colleague Meg, who I believe I saw earlier, if she's around, can type something in the chat. I believe has the most background information on those actual birth documents from Providence. Hi, Meg. Let's see if you can unmute. Okay. Meg, if you're still with us, if you want to type in the chat, that would be great. There was another question regarding if Eliza collected any art by women artists. That's a really good question. When she was in France, she was mostly collecting old masters, and I don't know, it would be really interesting to look back at the records, which mostly exist from an 1895, I believe it was 1895, exhibition of the work, which was, 1825, I believe, exhibition of a work of, I believe, about 100 selected paintings from her collection of 250. I don't recall off the top of my head of those exhibited, if any were by female artists, but that's a really, really good question. And obviously we have a little bit of more work to do. These programs always bring up more questions.
Hi, Shiloh and Erin. There's also a follow-up question to that about furniture makers. Were furniture makers predominantly men?
Yes, there were overwhelmingly the records that we have in America were that they were men. I suspect that there were some women who might have helped out in a father or husband's shop, but they don't turn up in the records. And all of the sort of named folks that we know about were male. But again, because women were not supposed to be doing this, they're not going to get publicized. So as I said, I think that there were women in workshops, but they don't get the glory.
We've got Meg on the line.
Hi. So most of our sources suggest that Eliza Jumel was born in Providence, Rhode Island. Specifically, who she was born to varies a bit. Her obituary states that she was actually born at sea, and her mother died in childbirth, and she was adopted by a woman named Capet. However, the internal narrative has been supported by some genealogical records that were sent over by Jamelle family members stating that she was the daughter of Phoebe, who we initially believed she was, and that her father was indeed a sailor who passed away at a young age. Her mother remarried. Specifics of that story vary, and a lot of it is based, as Shiloh had mentioned, there's a lot of myth involved. And I think, it points to a great question, who tells your story, who remains to tell your story? And it seems pretty obvious that Eliza Jumel tried to edit and revise a bit of her story. And it's, it's all still a mystery and a work in discovery.
And I would like to add too, I've noticed on some New York State and federal census records and other documents that her age, her birth year tends to shift, and even her nationality. I did see, I think it was on a state census record in 1855 where she said that she was French.
Yeah. Fascinating.
I think it's also worth noting that Eliza lived to be 90 years old or potentially 92, depending on which birth year you're going with, and very likely had what would be easily recognizable today as dementia or Alzheimer's. But of course, there was no such diagnosis back then. So, whether it was embellishment or, a little bit of dementia, we will never know.
Thanks, Megan, for sharing that. We are nearing the evening's end. If there are any final questions, feel free to put them in the chat. There was another follow-up question regarding the papers of Eliza and Stephen. Of the things the question is, do you have any sense of the kind of relationship that they had? The letters that I've read mostly are strictly business related, and sent to each other when Stephen's in France and Eliza's in New York, mostly about acquisitions, about furnishings or collecting rent at one of their properties. Megan or any of our docents who've spent time with the letters, do you have any thoughts on this?
I read a letter that Stephen wrote to Eliza from France, and it did seem very affectionate. Whether or not those strong affections were returned on Eliza's behalf, I'm not sure, but it did seem that Stephen was caring or concerned, at least.
I think a more interesting question to me would be the relationship between her second husband, Aaron Burr, and Eliza as well. especially given the fact that she initiated a divorce.
Well, thank you, everyone. There is one final comment from Helene in the chat. I believe that wallpaper that you're referring to, is it the Octagon Room? The one with the birds? Yes, okay. So that one was actually documented to a little bit later of a period. And when we went through the reinterpretation plan, we decided to reinterpret that space as 1825. And the wallpaper was from a little bit later than that, 1850s, 1860s. So that compounded with the fact that we had that primary source document about Eliza wanting cloud wallpaper for the back room, allowed us to really take a look and present the room a little bit more historically accurate. Again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This has been a wonderful program. Thank you to Erin for sharing all that she did about gendered spaces and decorative arts. Thanks to my amazing team, Meg, and our docents who are on the line. It was a really great conversation, and we hope to have you join us next time for our May program, which is about community gardens and the Heritage Rose District. Thank you, everyone.